Who was he?
Seo Jinwoo was already moving before the low murmur of the gala crowd could settle into silence. 1 second, he was the picture of absolute authority in the center of the ballroom, the ruthless head of Seoul's most dominant syndicate, nursing a glass of scotch while subordinates waited for his smallest nod. The next second, his hand tightened until the crystal nearly shattered, his intense gaze locking onto a shadowy corner of the balcony where a splash of pink hair moved alongside a man he didn't recognize. He lunged forward, his controlled presence evaporating as he shoved past high-ranking officials and silent bodyguards, his target already in sight. He reached the darkened corridor just as the heavy doors swung shut, his jaw tight with a rage he hadn't felt in years. He didn't ask, he didn't wait. He slammed his palm against the cold marble wall, pinning Dominique Hayes against the stone before she could even utter a greeting. Dominique gasped, her wide eyes and parted lips reflecting visible fear and shock as she was caught off guard by his sudden, suffocating closeness. Who was he? Jinwoo's voice was a low growl, his ragged breathing the only sound in the darkened hall. The man from the balcony. Dominique didn't speak. She only stared back with a quiet strength that infuriated him more. He didn't care about the gala. He didn't care about the syndicate war brewing outside. The world stilled. He only saw the woman he was dangerously obsessed with, and the terrifying reality that his mafia-bred possessiveness had finally pushed him over the edge. Some people watch history, our viewers study it. Welcome to Afro-Korean Scripts with Maya. We have a long list of secrets to share, so hit that subscribe button to keep your clearance level updated. The neon pulse of Seoul usually felt like a grid Seo Jinwoo had long ago mastered, a city where every shadow operated under his absolute authority and every player knew their place. But the night he first encountered Dominique Hayes, the grid shifted. It happened in a rain-slicked alleyway behind one of his high-end clubs, far from the slick, intimidating luxury of his penthouse. He had stepped out for a moment of quiet, his powerful, controlled presence cutting through the damp air when he saw her. She wasn't begging or cowering, despite being cornered by two low-level drifters looking for an easy target. Instead, Dominique stood her ground, her long, straight pink hair plastered against her smooth brown skin by the drizzle. What stopped Jinwoo in his tracks wasn't her beauty, though it was striking, but her inner resolve. Her wide eyes held a quiet strength that refused to dim even as she was caught off guard in a foreign city. She didn't look for a savior, she looked for an opening. Jinwoo's intense gaze locked onto her, and for the first time in years, his emotional detachment cracked. He didn't just want to help her, he felt a sudden, dangerously obsessed need to own that strength. With a single sharp nod to the bodyguards trailing him, the threat was neutralized in seconds, the drifters vanishing into the night at the mere sight of his dark neck tattoo and a ruthless authority. He stepped into the light of a flickering street lamp, his impeccable grooming a stark contrast to the grit of the alleyway. Dominique breathed heavily, her lips parted in vulnerability and emotional tension, but she didn't run. She looked at him, really looked at him, past the sharply dressed exterior to the restrained danger beneath. "You should be more careful, Dominique," he said, her name sounding like a vow in his low growl of a voice. He hadn't asked her name yet, but he already knew it. He had already decided she was his. That night marked the beginning of his obsessive pursuit. He began as a shadow in her life, a billionaire mafia boss who ensured her rent was always paid through anonymous grants and that her favorite table at the cafe was always vacant. He watched her from the tinted windows of his black sedans, his jaw tight with a growing, intense, and controlled possessiveness. He was a man used to control and confrontation, and Dominique was the only person who seemed unaware that she was already caught in his web. The transition from the rain-slicked alleys to the velvet-lined corridors of Jinwoo's world happened with a speed that left Dominique breathless. He began to shower her with the full weight of his billionaire luxury, replacing her modest life with a slick, intimidating opulence that felt more like a fortress than a gift. Every day brought new tokens of his obsessive pursuit. Dresses of hand-spun silk that matched her pink hair, rare jewels that seemed to sparkle with restrained danger, and an apartment overlooking the Han River that was as beautiful as it was secluded. Jinwoo's presence became a constant, suffocating gravity. He was always there, a sharply dressed figure watching her with an intense gaze that made her feel like the most precious object in his collection. He spoke in a low growl of plans for her future, but those plans never seemed to include anyone else. Slowly, the world outside began to fade. Her calls to friends were dropped by unexplained signal interference. Her shifts at the art gallery were canceled after Jinwoo made a massive anonymous donation that required the building to be closed for renovations. Dominique felt the vulnerability and emotional tension of her situation growing. She was caught in a gilded cage, surrounded by impeccable grooming and ruthless authority, yet she was more alone than she had ever been. When she questioned him, her wide eyes searching his for the man who had saved her in the alley, Jinwoo would only pull her closer, his jaw tight with a powerful, controlled presence, his dark neck tattoo catching the light of a $1,000 chandelier. "You don't need them, Dominique," he whispered one evening. "They don't understand you. Not like I do." He was used to control and confrontation, and he was systematically removing any variable he could not dictate. As he tucked a strand of her pink hair behind her ear, his touch was firm yet controlled, suggesting protection while subtly reinforcing his absolute authority. Dominique looked at him with a quiet strength, a flickering inner resolve that suggested she was beginning to see the bars of the cage he was building around her. She was caught off guard by the depth of his possessiveness, unaware that the gala and his ultimate loss of control was only a heartbeat away. The high-ceilinged silence of the private gallery was meant to be a sanctuary of culture, but for Seo Jin-woo, it felt like a trap. He moved through the space with a powerful, controlled presence, his sharply dressed figure drawing the eyes of every socialite in the room, yet his own intense gaze never strayed from Dominique. She was a vision in the center of the hall, her pink hair glowing under the spotlights. But for the first time in weeks, she wasn't looking for him. She was laughing, a genuine, unrestrained sound, with the man who had approached her near a sprawling, abstract canvas. From the shadows, Jinwoo's jaw tightened until it ached. His emotional detachment, the hallmark of his absolute authority, evaporated in a single, searing heat. He watched as the stranger reached out to touch Dominique's arm, a familiar gesture that implied a history Jinwoo had not authorized. Every instinct of his mafia-bred possessiveness flared to life. He didn't see a friend, he saw a thief. He didn't see a conversation, he saw a betrayal of the gilded cage he had painstakingly built. Dominique turned, her wide eyes catching Jinwoo's silhouette across the room. The laughter died instantly, replaced by a visible fear and shock as she registered the restrained danger radiating from him. Before she could offer an explanation, Jinwoo was across the floor, his impeccable grooming a mask for the ruthless authority surging beneath. He didn't acknowledge the other man, he simply gripped Dominique's elbow with a touch that was firm yet controlled and steered her toward the darkened corridor of the VIP wing. He slammed his palm against the cold marble wall, pinning her there as the heavy doors swung shut on the gala's muffled music. The power imbalance was absolute. Dominique was pressed against the stone, her lips parted in a mix of vulnerability and emotional tension, her breath hitching as he leaned into her space. The dark neck tattoo above his collar seemed to pulse with his low growl of a voice. "Who was he, Dominique?" he demanded, his eyes locked onto hers with a jealousy that bordered on madness. "I told you that you didn't need anyone else. I told you that you were mine." Dominique stared back, her inner resolve flickering despite the terror. "He's just an old friend, Jinwoo, from before." "There is no before for you anymore," he interrupted, his voice a low growl that brooked no argument. His controlled presence was gone, replaced by a raw, intense, and controlled need to crush any part of her he did not own. In that moment of explosive jealousy, the forbidden attraction between them turned into a high-tension confrontation, leaving Dominique to realize that her billionaire mafia boss was a man who would rather break her than lose her. The high-rise penthouse was air and cold, a sterile environment that mirrored Seo Jin-woo's absolute authority. Following the confrontation at the gala, a heavy, simmering tension settled between them, thick with the scent of expensive rain and the restrained danger that followed Jin-woo like a shadow. Dominique sat by the floor-to-ceiling windows, her long, straight pink hair draped over her shoulders as she stared at the sprawling lights of Seoul. She felt the vulnerability and emotional tension of a woman caught in a storm, yet her inner resolve kept her from breaking. Every time she heard his footsteps, the rhythmic, powerful, controlled presence of a man who owned the city, her heart betrayed her. She was caught in a cycle of forbidden attraction, drawn to the slick, intimidating way he moved and the intense gaze that made her feel like the center of his universe. But the desire was now irrevocably tangled with visible fear and shock. She looked at her smooth brown skin where his hand had pinned her against the marble, feeling the ghost of his firm yet controlled touch. She was beginning to realize the true depth of his dark past. While Jin-woo was sharply dressed in suits that cost more than her education, the dark neck tattoo peeking above his collar was a constant reminder of his ruthless authority and criminal past. She had seen glimpses of it in the way his men spoke to him, in low growls of deference, and in the intense and controlled way he handled anyone who dared to glance her way. He wasn't just a billionaire, he was a mafia boss who viewed love as a confrontation to be won. Jin-woo entered the room, his impeccable grooming masking the explosive jealousy that still simmered beneath his skin. He didn't speak, but his intense gaze locked on her, his jaw tight with a mafia-bred possessiveness that both terrified and exhilarated her. He walked to her, his presence a dominance that forced her to look up. "You're trembling, Dominique," his voice said, a low growl of restrained danger. "I'm afraid of you, of what you do." He reached down, his touch firm yet controlled, as he lifted her chin. "I am the only thing in this city that will never hurt you," he promised, though the ruthless authority in his eyes suggested he was the only one allowed to. Dominique closed her eyes, leaning into the hand of the man who was her obsessive pursuit. She was falling for a jealous boss, a man of emotional detachment who was slowly making her his one weakness, and the emotional danger of that truth was a cage she wasn't sure she wanted to leave. The predator-prey dynamic of Seoul's underworld was a machine that never truly slept, fueled by a constant search for a crack in the absolute authority of Seo Jin-woo. While Jin-woo remained locked in his obsessive pursuit within the penthouse, a different kind of intense gaze was fixed upon Dominique Hayes from the street level. The rival syndicate, led by men who lacked Jin-woo's impeccable grooming but shared his ruthless authority, had spent months looking for a way to dismantle his empire. They had finally found it, the woman with the pink hair who had become the billionaire boss's one weakness. Dominique felt the shifts before she saw it. The quiet strength she had cultivated was now a sensory alarm, tingling at the back of her neck as she walked through the upscale shopping districts Jin-woo allowed her to visit. The powerful, controlled presence that usually accompanied her, Jin-woo's personal security, seemed to be struggling against a new, shadowed interference. Black sedans with tinted windows, similar to Jin-woo's but lacking his restrained danger, began to appear at every corner. She was being tailed, caught between the mafia-bred possessiveness of the man she loved and the cold calculation of his enemies. Every time she stepped out of a boutique, she felt the vulnerability and emotional tension of being a marked woman. The silent witnesses were no longer socialites, but scouts for a rival criminal past, documenting her movements and measuring the emotional danger she posed to Jin-woo's focus. They saw her wide eyes and her smooth brown skin, but they only cared about the dominance she held over the man who ruled Seoul. To them, she was not a person, but a lever to be pulled. When Jinwoo arrived to collect her that evening, his jaw was tight, his intense gaze scanning the street for the restrained danger he knew was closing in. He didn't speak of the threat, but his touch as he guided her into the car was firm yet controlled, a silent admission that the gilded cage was no longer just about his jealousy, it was about her survival. Dominique looked at him with visible fear and shock, her wide eyes fixed on the blood staining Jinwoo's impeccable grooming. The mafia-bred possessiveness she had sensed in the alley was now a visceral, intense, and controlled violence. She saw the man she loved transform into the jealous boss of the rumors, a man who viewed her not as a partner, but a territory to be defended with ruthless authority. "Jinwoo, stop!" she cried, her lips parted in horror. He turned toward her, his breathing ragged, his dark neck tattoo flushed with the heat of the struggle. For a second, the restrained danger in his eyes was directed at her, a dominance that demanded she be grateful for his protection. But the inner resolve that had first captivated him now drove her toward a different choice. She couldn't stay in a gilded cage where the price of his love was the blood of anyone who dared to look her way. As the club's security swarmed to manage the fallout, Dominique took advantage of the emotional danger and confusion. She backed away, her smooth brown skin pale under the neon lights, and vanished into the rain-slicked streets of Seoul. She fled from his ruthless authority, leaving behind the billionaire luxury for the uncertainty of the night. She was no longer a one weakness to be guarded. She was a woman reclaiming her quiet strength from a man who had finally lost the one thing he couldn't own, her trust. The shadows of Seoul were no longer a grid Jinwoo mastered. They had become a labyrinth that swallowed Dominique whole. She had been missing for less than 3 hours when the high-frequency vibration of his phone cut through the deathly silence of his office. His powerful, controlled presence was a fraying mask, his jaw tight as he stared at the screen. It was an anonymous message, a single image that caused his emotional detachment to shatter into 1,000 jagged shards. The photo was grainy, taken in the harsh, flickering light of a basement that reeked of the criminal past he had tried to outrun. Dominique was there, her long, straight pink hair matted with grime, her smooth brown skin bruised where she had struggled against her captors. That it was her wide eyes that undid him. They were filled with visible fear and shock, a raw vulnerability and emotional tension that he had promised to protect her from. She was pressed against a concrete pillar, her lips parted as if mid-scream, caught in the crosshairs of a rival syndicate that had no regard for her inner resolve. A low growl that sounded more like a wounded animal than a billionaire mafia boss escaped his throat. The restrained danger he usually wore like a tailored suit erupted into a visceral, intense, and controlled fury. He swept the crystal decanters from his desk in a single, violent motion, the dark neck tattoo on his throat pulsing with a lethal heat. They hadn't just taken his one weakness, they had desecrated the only thing that made him feel human. His impeccable grooming was forgotten as he lunged for his jacket, his intense gaze burning with a ruthless authority that signaled a total war. He didn't call his lieutenants for a strategy meeting, he didn't coordinate with his security detail. The mafia-bred possessiveness that had once driven Dominique away was now the only thing keeping him from collapsing. The power imbalance had shifted. The man who ruled Seoul was now a slave to a photo, his icy composure replaced by a dangerous obsession to bring her back or burn the city to the ground trying. "You should have killed me," he whispered into the empty room, his voice a low growl of restrained danger, "because I am coming for her, and I am bringing hell with me." The emotional danger was no longer a simmering tension, it was a wildfire, and Seo Jin-woo was the center of the flame. The warehouse district on the outskirts of the Han River was a graveyard of rusted steel and long-forgotten secrets, the perfect stage for the restrained dangers Seo Jin-woo was about to unleash. He moved through the shadows with a powerful, controlled presence that had been honed by years of ruthless authority. But the impeccable grooming of the billionaire was gone. His shirt was torn, his dark neck tattoo stood out against skin slick with rain and sweat, and his intense gaze held a lethal clarity. He didn't come with an army, he came as a man who had realized that his absolute authority meant nothing if he couldn't protect the woman who had pierced his emotional detachment. The first sentinel fell before he could even raise a weapon, neutralized by the intense and controlled precision of a man who viewed this confrontation as a sacred duty. Jin Woo navigated the maze of shipping containers with a mafia-bred possessiveness that turned every obstacle into a target. He was a ghost in the dark, a billionaire mafia boss reclaiming his criminal past to serve a singular, desperate purpose. Every strike he delivered was a silent vow to Dominique, a firm yet controlled demonstration that the dominance she feared could be the very thing that saved her. He breached the central chamber just as the rival boss moved a blade toward Dominique's smooth brown skin. The vulnerability and emotional tension in the room reached a breaking point as Jin Woo stepped into the light, his jaw tight and his intense gaze locked onto the men who had dared to touch his one weakness. He didn't hesitate. The explosive jealousy of the past was replaced by a cold, ruthless authority that prioritized her safety above all else. In a blur of motion, he tore through the remaining captors, his controlled presence becoming a shield that blocked her from the violence. When the dust settled, Jin Woo stood over the fallen, his breathing heavy but his focus unwavering. He turned to Dominique, who watched him with visible fear and shock that slowly softened into a quiet strength as she saw the man beneath the monster. He didn't reach for her with the mafia-bred possessiveness of a captor. He offered his hand with the restrained danger of a protector. "I'm here," he whispered, his voice a low growl of redemption. Dominique took his hand, her wide eyes searching his and finding an inner resolve that mirrored her own. In the wreckage of the warehouse, Jin Woo had proven that his ruthless authority could be a weapon of protection, and that his jealous boss persona had finally died to make room for a man who would burn the world to keep her safe. The morning sun broke over the Han River, not with the harsh neon glare of the city's underworld, but with a soft, persistent light that signaled a genuine transformation. In the quiet of his high-rise penthouse, Seo Jin-woo stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows, though he no longer looked out as a man surveying a kingdom. He had spent the previous night systematically dismantling the absolute authority he had spent a decade building, handing over the reins of his dominant syndicate to his most trusted lieutenants, under the condition that they move toward legitimate enterprise. The dark neck tattoo that had once been a symbol of ruthless authority was now merely a scar of a criminal past he was leaving behind. He turned as Dominique entered the room, her long, straight pink hair catching the early light. The vulnerability and emotional tension that had once defined their dynamic had evaporated, replaced by a quiet strength and a true partnership that needed no gilded cage. She walked to him, her smooth brown skin glowing, and for the first time, Jin-woo didn't meet her with an intense gaze meant to dominate. He met her with a look of restrained danger finally put to rest, a gaze of profound, humble devotion. "It's done," he said, his low growl now a soft, steady resonance. "The intimidating legacy of Seo Jin-woo ended at midnight. I am no longer the king of Seoul shadows." Dominique reached up, her touch firm yet controlled, as she traced the line of his jaw. She no longer looked at him with visible fear and shock, but with an inner resolve that had become the anchor of his new life. "And who are you now?" she whispered, her wide eyes locked onto his. "I am a man who realized that owning a city is nothing compared to being worthy of you," he replied, his powerful, controlled presence shifting into a gesture of surrender as he pulled her close. The forbidden attraction that had sparked in a rain-slicked alley had matured into a bond built on integrity and truth. Jin-woo had stepped down from his criminal throne to stand on equal ground with a woman who had pierced his emotional detachment. As they looked out at the city together, the power imbalance was gone. The jealous boss had been replaced by a partner, and the mafia-bred possessiveness had been traded for a love that required no chains. They were no longer characters in a dark romance of dominance and vulnerability, but two souls who had braved the emotional danger to find a peace they never expected to own.